In a tense congressional hearing, Jasmine Crockett stood alone against a wall of black robes and hidden decisions, facing Justice Brett Kavanaugh over the court's double standards and ethical blind spots. With mounting public outrage and two landmark cases in conflict, she challenged the very core of judicial credibility. Her voice pierced decades of silence, demanding answers that no one dared to ask. Millions watched as law met conscience and power started to flinch. When one woman calls out the court's contradictions, what happens next? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The chamber pulsed with silence so thick it felt like thunder held its breath. Dozens of reporters packed the walls, pens ready, eyes locked forward. Bright overhead lights bore down like judgment itself. The air smelled of nerves, old paper, and something electric, something about to explode. Today's topic, constitutional consistency. But everyone knew this was no policy debate. This was war dressed in legal robes. Brett Kavanaugh entered first, robe flowing, chin high, eyes cold. He moved like a monarch reclaiming territory. When he sat, it wasn't on a chair. It was a throne. Calm, unbothered, invincible. Then the doors opened again. Jasmine Crockett walked in. No robe, no entourage. Just steady steps, a binder in hand, and eyes sharp enough to cut steel. She was smaller, quieter, but when she locked eyes with Kavanaugh, the entire room tensed. Power had met something more dangerous. Purpose. The silence didn't last long, because when Kavanaugh finally spoke, it wasn't an answer. It was a warning. These are complex constitutional matters that require significant legal expertise, Kavanaugh said, his voice calm, but sharpened like a blade. And I would caution against conflating fundamentally different cases under the illusion of simplicity. He leaned back slightly, fingers steepled, eyes fixed on Crockett with the patronizing stare of someone who believed he was above being questioned. Then came the second blow. There's a reason we interpret the Constitution from the bench, not from campaign offices. The jab was subtle, but the insult wasn't. He thought this was already over. That one dismissive remark and a nod to judicial superiority would send her spiraling into silence or sound bites. He assumed she came for political theater, not blood. But what Kavanaugh didn't realize was that Jasmine Crockett hadn't come to perform. She'd come to prosecute. She didn't blink. She didn't even flinch. Her voice was calm, low, and devastating. "Let's talk about consistency, Justice," she began. "In Americans for Prosperity versus Bonta, you voted to strike down California's requirement for charities to disclose donor identities, even when the information was protected confidential and used solely by regulators. You called it an unconstitutional burden on the freedom of association. You applied strict scrutiny to protect those donors." Her eyes never left his. Then she flipped the page in her binder with a single flick. But in McKesson versus Doe, a protest organizer who never committed a violent act was threatened with personal liability because someone else in a crowd did. The burden in that case wasn't regulatory paperwork. It was financial destruction, and yet the court refused to apply strict scrutiny. You let that case go forward. Now the room wasn't just silent, it was frozen. Kavanaugh sat up straighter. The blood drained just slightly from his face. His jaw tightened. "Congresswoman," he said carefully, "those two cases operate in entirely different constitutional frameworks. Protest liability and donor privacy involve distinct government interests." But Crockett cut him off, gently but surgically. "Both cases deal with freedom of association, Justice. In Bonta, it was disclosure to officials, kept private. In McKesson, it was a man facing a lawsuit for organizing a protest. One received the full force of constitutional protection. The other got tossed aside. You called one an existential threat and the other just noise." Kavanaugh blinked hard. He reached for a glass of water but didn't drink. From the back of the room, a reporter whispered, "She's cutting him open." The contrast was brutal. Kavanaugh came in with robes, ego, and legacy. Crockett came with evidence, memory, and a binder full of every inconsistency he thought no one would dare say out loud. And now the robe wasn't armor anymore. It was glass. Because what started as a lecture was fast becoming a cross-examination. But Crockett didn't let the silence settle. She cracked it wide open, and what came next sent a chill through the entire room. "Let's move to another pair of cases, Justice," Crockett said, flipping to a new page, her voice crisp but carrying weight like a loaded gavel. "Kennedy v. Bremerton School District versus City of Austin v. Reagan, National Advertising." She said the names like they were charges in an indictment. The temperature in the room dropped. Kavanaugh's expression remained neutral, but the way he gripped the edge of the table betrayed him. "In Kennedy," she continued, "this court protected a high school football coach's right to conduct public, performative prayer at midfield, right after games surrounded by students." She didn't raise her voice, but the impact of her words struck like a hammer. "Despite the fact that students felt indirect pressure to participate, you said that concern was speculative. You gave that coach the highest level of protection, strict scrutiny." Crockett didn't wait for a reply. Then came City of Austin, a case about billboards, digital signage, commercial speech. The city restricted them, citing vague concerns about visual clutter and driver safety. And you upheld it. She leaned in, just slightly. "You gave billboards less protection than a man praying in front of high school students. Can you explain why a theoretical distraction to drivers justifies speech restriction, but coercion of minors in a school setting doesn't?" That was the moment the shift became visible. Kavanaugh's eyes narrowed, his jaw clenched. The legal giant who had walked in like royalty now sat across from a woman who'd peeled back the robe and showed the inconsistencies bleeding underneath. "These cases," he began slowly, "present very different historical and constitutional contexts. Religion has long held a central place in First Amendment protection. And so has free speech," Crockett shot back, not missing a beat, "especially in public spaces, especially when the government is deciding what kind of speech deserves protection. In Kennedy, the court dismissed student vulnerability. In Austin, it accepted aesthetic preference as a valid reason to restrict speech. What standard are we applying here, principle or preference?" A ripple moved through the room. Crockett kept going, eyes locked on Kavanaugh like a surgeon with a steady hand. "Religious speech in public gets strict scrutiny. Political speech on protest signs, lower scrutiny. Labor speech, sometimes none at all. Billboard content, intermediate at best. You're building a hierarchy of expression, justice, and the Constitution never authorized that." Kavanaugh shifted in his chair again. "Context matters," he replied, the edge in his voice now unmistakable. "These are not identical scenarios, and it is the role of the court to interpret them accordingly. But the principles should be consistent," Crockett said firmly. "Same Constitution, same First Amendment, same promise to protect expression. No matter who is speaking or what they're saying, that promise isn't yours to adjust depending on the message." No one in the room moved, because this wasn't just sharp questioning anymore. This was the moment it became obvious. The robe wasn't protecting him. The Constitution wasn't defending him. Only his answers could, and they weren't coming fast enough. But Crockett wasn't done cutting. She had one more blade, and this one came straight from Kavanaugh's own hand. She placed a printed article flat on the table, slid it slightly toward the witness chair, then looked him dead in the eye. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "Justice Kavanaugh," she began, "let me quote you." Then she read it, slowly, deliberately, like lowering the hammer of a judge's gavel. "The cardinal sin of First Amendment jurisprudence is treating similar speech differently based on the identity of the speaker." Harvard Law Review, 2012. The air cracked. It wasn't the words themselves. It was the silence they left behind, like a sudden drop in altitude on a plane. One of the Republican aides lowered his head. Reporters blinked at each other. Cameras zoomed in. It felt like the room had inhaled but forgotten how to exhale. Kavanaugh's expression froze. His lips parted just slightly. He adjusted his tie, not once but twice. His fingers tapped the table, trying to appear thoughtful, but they trembled. He hadn't expected his own doctrine to be turned against him like a blade. Crockett leaned forward slightly, not to intimidate, but to press. "You stand by that statement, don't you?" she asked. Kavanaugh's throat moved as he swallowed. "Yes," he replied slowly. I do." "Good," she said, flipping the next tab in her binder. Because I've reviewed your record. 23 First Amendment cases since you joined the court. She reached beneath the desk and lifted a large laminated chart, color-coded, case by case, with red and green boxes so bold even the back row could see. She pointed. In every case involving religious institutions, conservative advocacy groups, or corporate speakers, you applied strict scrutiny, 100%, no exceptions. She turned the chart with a snap. But in cases involving labor unions, civil rights protesters, and public demonstrations, you applied rational basis or intermediate scrutiny 91% of the time. Her voice, cool as steel, sliced through the tension. Same amendment, same rights, but a different standard depending on who was speaking. A ripple ran through the gallery. Phones were lifted. A few people, staffers, maybe interns, were visibly stunned. This wasn't just a political hit. This was a data-backed dismantling. Kavanaugh didn't speak. He couldn't. His brow furrowed, but he said nothing. His silence was no longer power. It was paralysis. Crockett pressed again. Justice, how does that square with your own writing? The cardinal sin, she repeated softly now, as if reminding him what courtroom he was sitting in. How do you explain a pattern where preferred speakers, religious, corporate, ideological allies, get the court's full protection, and disfavored speakers, labor organizers, racial justice groups, get leftovers? Kavanaugh finally opened his mouth. Each case is fact-specific, he said tightly. We interpret based on precedent, context. But Crockett cut him off, not with volume, but with timing. Context doesn't erase consistency, and patterns don't form by accident. She pointed at the chart again. This isn't cherry-picking. This is your jurisprudence laid bare. You wrote the rule, and you broke it. Kavanaugh looked down at the table, blinked twice, then looked up, but not at Crockett, at the committee, as if silently pleading for a life raft. None came. From the press box, a journalist whispered, "He just lost the room." Another replied, "No, he lost the high ground." Because he had. In that moment, Brett Kavanaugh was no longer the powerful jurist giving a lecture. He was the one being examined. His words, his votes, his record. And across from him sat the woman he once tried to dismiss. But she wasn't seeking validation. She was delivering verdicts. And America was watching. Then came the moment no one could look away from, when Jasmine Crockett didn't just challenge the court. She unveiled it. She raised her hand once, and the screen behind her roared to life. A massive chart appeared, bright, brutal, and undeniable. Green boxes lined one column. Red boxes flooded the other. Names of landmark cases ran across the rows like gravestones. It wasn't just data, it was indictment. Crockett stepped to the side, giving the entire room a clear view of what she was about to unleash. "Let me be absolutely clear," she said, her voice like a match about to strike. "This is not conjecture. This is not spin. This is your record, Justice." She pointed to the left side of the screen. Green, glowing, confident. These are the First Amendment cases involving religious organizations, corporate entities, or conservative advocacy groups. In every single one, the court applied strict scrutiny, the highest level of protection available under constitutional law. 100%. Then she turned to the right side. And these, she paused, letting the wave build, are the cases involving labor unions, racial justice protests, civil rights organizers. In 91% of those rulings, the court applied rational basis or intermediate scrutiny. Not even close to equal protection. The silence was nuclear. Then came the sentence that detonated the chamber. The evidence suggests the court's rulings are not guided by consistent principles, but by ideology. People didn't just sit still. They locked into place. Members of Congress froze mid-note. Reporters' fingers hovered above keyboards, unsure whether to type or gasp. One camera lens zoomed so tight it caught the twitch in Kavanaugh's jaw. From across the aisle, a Republican senator, known for his sharp critiques of Crockett, lowered his glasses and muttered under his breath, "I disagree with her politics, but that was a masterclass." No one disagreed. Kavanaugh sat stone still, but something had cracked. His hands fidgeted slightly beneath the table. His mouth opened, then closed again. The confidence that had filled his voice earlier was gone, drained like air from a punctured tire. He finally spoke, but the tone had changed. No authority, no edge, just the hollow echo of a man trying to regain balance. When interpreting precedent, he said, voice shaky, we must take care to differentiate case-specific factors and... But Crockett didn't even need to interrupt. The tremble in his speech did it for her. This was no longer a contest of credentials. It was exposure, the kind you don't recover from in a hearing, the kind that follows you, that stains the robes. Because in that moment, he wasn't the teacher anymore. He was the case study. Crockett stood firm, her chart still glowing behind her like a courtroom x-ray, revealing the fractures in what had been called originalism, textualism, neutrality. But under her spotlight, it all looked the same. Ideological preference dressed as law. One aide leaned toward another and whispered, she's not just questioning him. She's putting the whole court on trial. And she was. Kavanaugh glanced at the chart one last time, then looked away. Because when facts speak that loudly, even a Supreme Court justice can't shout over them. Not when the room no longer belongs to him. It belonged to her. But Crockett hadn't come just to expose contradictions. She came to deliver the final blow, and it hit like a cannon in a glass cathedral. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She stood completely still, letting the weight of her words fall with precision. And then, with absolute clarity, she said, the First Amendment doesn't protect only popular speech or powerful speakers. It must apply equally to all. The words didn't echo. They detonated. For a moment, the room didn't know how to react. Every breath got stuck in every chest. Even the ceiling lights seemed to dim under the pressure of that single sentence. It was so simple, so obvious, and yet no one in that room had dared to say it until now. Then slowly, like a fuse catching fire, applause broke out. One hand, then two, then a wave. From committee aides, from journalists, even from a few Republican members who had spent years opposing her. The sound grew, not loud but deep, filled with something heavier than politics, something irreversible. A conservative lawmaker near the back whispered to no one in particular, I don't agree with her. But my God, that was a masterclass. Crockett didn't flinch. She didn't look surprised. She just stood there like a conductor who knew exactly when the music would change. She had turned a hearing into a verdict, and the jury, it seemed, had just reached consensus. Across the table, Brett Kavanaugh sat frozen. His jaw had tensed. His hands clutched the arms of his chair, knuckles white. He tried to speak, and when he finally did, it came out like static from a broken speaker. Each case is unique. He repeated it, not because it convinced anyone, but because it was all he had left. Each case is unique. The phrase, once a shield, now sounded like a retreat, and that's when the contrast hit its peak. On one side of the table, a Supreme Court justice unraveling, clinging to procedural phrases like a drowning man to driftwood. On the other, a Congresswoman standing in full command of the law, the facts, and the room itself. Kavanaugh had arrived dressed in invincibility. Crockett had walked in draped in doubt. But now, he looked like a man out of time, and she looked like the future breathing down the court's neck. A CNN reporter near the door mouthed to her producer, we're watching a legacy collapse. A veteran journalist from the Washington Post simply scribbled, the robe cracked. And in the stillness that followed, no one questioned who the room now belonged to, because it wasn't the man who'd once sat in confirmation hearings surrounded by shields of deference. It wasn't the justice who'd once waved away criticism with doctrine and distance. It was Jasmine Crockett. She had walked in with a binder and a quiet voice. She now stood with the power to make a nation listen. And as Kavanaugh repeated the same broken phrase again, each case is unique. Everyone knew. The case that would be remembered was this one, and he had already lost it. But the echo of that moment didn't stay in the hearing room. It tore through the country like wildfire. Within hours, the confrontation went viral. The clip of Jasmine Crockett delivering her line, the First Amendment doesn't protect only popular speech or powerful speakers. It must apply equally to all, was everywhere. Twitter, YouTube, TikTok. The video racked up over 30 million views in just 24 hours, with headlines screaming, "Congresswoman dismantles Supreme Court Justice, live on air." The raw footage of Kavanaugh stammering, Crockett calmly eviscerating inconsistencies, and the chamber erupting in spontaneous applause spread like lightning. Memes surfaced within the hour. News anchors couldn't look away. Even late-night shows interrupted their usual punchlines to air the unedited exchange. People weren't just watching. They were replaying, analyzing, and quoting it. On college campuses, in coffee shops, at kitchen tables, everyone was talking about what had just happened, and they weren't talking about Kavanaugh. By noon the next day, Harvard law professor Lawrence Tribe posted a rare statement. "In 50 years of constitutional scholarship, I've rarely seen a sitting justice challenge this precisely and this effectively." Crockett's questioning is a watershed moment in First Amendment discourse. His words weren't hyperbole, they were confirmation. Almost overnight, law schools across the country began inserting the hearing into their constitutional law curriculum. Casebooks were updated mid-semester. Professors dropped planned lectures to play the footage and unpack the constitutional logic. The American Bar Association published a feature within 48 hours, titling it "Consistency, Scrutiny, and the Crockett Confrontation." By the end of the week, what had once been a one-line dismissal from a Supreme Court justice had turned into a new framework. Legal scholars called it the Crockett test. It was simple, but brutal in its demand. Does the court apply the same standard of constitutional scrutiny regardless of the speaker's identity or ideology? And suddenly, every recent First Amendment decision was being dragged through that lens. Kavanaugh's previous rulings were dissected in blogs, journals, podcasts. Charts circulated showing his inconsistencies, now made public under Crockett's cross-examination. His defenders called it overreach, but they couldn't deny the impact. The robe no longer shielded him. He had become the example. One legal podcast summed it up clearly. Kavanaugh used to be the mountain no one dared to scale. After Crockett, he's the cautionary tale taught in 1L classrooms. Meanwhile, Crockett, once a rising but relatively unknown congresswoman from Texas, became a symbol, a face for accountability, for legal precision, for standing toe-to-toe with power and not blinking. In just days, she was invited to speak at Yale, Georgetown, Berkeley. The National Association of Women Lawyers called her the most influential voice in constitutional law of the year. Students wore shirts printed with her, quote, "Legal TikTok" turned her hearing into a teaching series. Even skeptics, people who had never agreed with her politics, admitted one thing. She had changed the conversation. And as the dust settled, the contrast between the two couldn't be more vivid. Kavanaugh, once untouchable, now seen as a man who preached neutrality but practiced favoritism. Crockett, once underestimated, now standing as the unexpected force who made the law listen again. Because in just a few minutes, she hadn't just challenged the court. She had redefined how America would judge it. But the real shock came when the American public, across all lines, didn't just react to the moment, they demanded change from it. Within 72 hours of the hearing, polls exploded across the country. According to a joint survey by Pew Research and Gallup, 71% of Americans, Republicans, Democrats, and independents alike, agreed on one thing. The Supreme Court must explain its inconsistencies in constitutional rulings. The result was stunning, not just because it was bipartisan, but because it was urgent. People weren't just watching a hearing. They were waking up to how much they'd stopped trusting the arbiters in black robes. One news anchor put it simply, Americans didn't see a debate, they saw a mask come off. But the most unexpected shift came from the middle-aged male demographic, particularly men over 50. The very audience that had long tuned out congressional hearings as partisan noise suddenly found themselves gripped. Crockett's composure, her precision, her refusal to be rattled. For men who'd grown cynical watching years of performative politics, she represented something they thought was extinct, conviction backed by clarity. "I haven't seen someone speak like that since the early 90s, said a retired veteran from Ohio. She didn't just talk, she dismantled him with facts. On conservative radio forums, Men who usually dismiss progressive lawmakers were writing posts like, "I still don't agree with her policies, but I respect the hell out of her backbone." Crockett had done the impossible. She didn't ask for their trust. She earned it. At the same time, a different fire ignited among younger voices. Law students from New York University to Stanford began circulating clips of the hearing with highlighted transcripts. In campus lecture halls, professors projected Crockett's cross-examination as the new standard for congressional oversight. One student-led legal journal titled their cover piece, "The Hearing That Taught Us How to Cross-Examine a Supreme Court Justice." Young attorneys, especially women and people of color, rallied around the footage like it was a rallying cry. Advocacy organizations called it a case study in institutional accountability. On social media, law students posted screenshots of Crockett with captions like, "This is how you keep your cool when power tries to talk down to you." It wasn't just admiration, it was inspiration. It was roadmap. But the divide it revealed stretched beyond political parties or age brackets. It was a confrontation between two Americas. One embodied by Brett Kavanaugh, closed chambers, insider networks, decisions shielded behind precedent and privilege. The other, embodied by Jasmine Crockett, open confrontation, public accountability, and the belief that even power must explain itself. As one legal analyst said on MSNBC, Kavanaugh now represents the quiet entitlement of the legal elite. Crockett, she's the voice breaking the sound barrier on behalf of everyone who's never had a seat at that table. The contrast was undeniable, and it was no longer confined to the courtroom. What had started as a hearing had become a cultural fault line, and Crockett was standing right at the center of it. But the ripple didn't stop at the public. It reached the marble halls of the court itself, and what began as a hearing turned into a reckoning behind closed doors. In the weeks following the hearing, something unusual began to stir inside the Supreme Court. According to leaked memos and court insiders, justices began having internal discussions about consistency, not behind lecterns, but in hushed conversations during chambers conferences. The word itself, once thrown around casually in judicial philosophy, now carried the weight of a loaded question. Are we truly applying the Constitution equally, or just claiming we are? It wasn't just the liberal bloc raising concerns. Sources told The New Yorker that even some conservative justices privately admitted Jasmine Crockett had struck a nerve, and worse, a legitimate one. One longtime clerk said, "They're not just annoyed, they're shaken." Her argument hit the soft spot they never thought anyone from Congress would dare touch: patterned ideology disguised as principle. Behind the curtain of judicial silence, Crockett's voice was echoing, uninvited, undeniable. The impact became even clearer when Justice Kavanaugh himself began shifting in subsequent rulings. In a high-profile protest case that term, observers noted a noticeable change in his tone. Gone were the sweeping, confident declarations about precedent. Instead, his concurrence opened with an unfamiliar phrase: "To ensure consistent scrutiny under the First Amendment, we must re-examine how standards are applied regardless of speaker identity." That line sent legal circles into overdrive. One SCOTUS blog analyst tweeted, "Wait, did Kavanaugh just say that out loud?" Another wrote, "Looks like Crockett isn't just influencing public opinion. She's rewriting the internal playbook." The legal press didn't hesitate to dig deeper. Politico ran the headline, "Can a Congresswoman shift the direction of the Supreme Court?" The Atlantic followed up with a long-form piece. One sentence, one chart, one reckoning. The day Crockett changed judicial politics. Reporters hounded former clerks. Former federal judges quietly admitted that this kind of rhetorical precision coming from outside the court was rare, but deadly effective. A retired appellate judge told NPR, "The justices don't like being questioned, but they hate being exposed." And suddenly Kavanaugh wasn't the teacher anymore. He was the one learning, in public and under pressure. From the outside, the difference was subtle. He still wore the robe, still wrote his opinions, still appeared composed on the bench. But legal experts noted a new caution in his writing, a hesitance to issue sweeping declarations. His footnotes grew longer, his language more tentative. In place of rigid textualism, there was now something looser. A man watching every word. Privately, insiders described a Kavanaugh in retreat, not from the court, but from the absolute certainty he once exuded. One conservative law clerk, speaking anonymously, said, "He used to own every room. Now, he second guesses before he even walks in." Another added, "Every time a First Amendment case hits the docket, you can feel the weight of that hearing still lingering." What no one dared say publicly was becoming whispered gospel. Jasmine Crockett had changed him. Meanwhile, Crockett's name started surfacing in unexpected places. Law review symposia titled entire panels, "The Crockett Principle." Federalist Society events quietly debated whether judicial neutrality had failed the conservative legal movement. Even constitutional originalists began citing her analysis, not to agree, but to address it, because ignoring her was no longer an option. She had become more than a congresswoman, more than a headline. She had become a shadow cast over chambers' conversations. Judges began referencing perception of bias more carefully. Oral arguments featured questions that directly mirrored her critiques. And through it all, Kavanaugh no longer answered the same way. The irony was searing. The man who once sat, confident and cold, trying to school a junior legislator on Kavanaugh was no longer unshakable. He was measured, cautious, sometimes even defensive. His concurrences started hedging. His dissents grew longer, less forceful. As one law professor joked, "He doesn't write opinions anymore. He writes apologies dressed as analysis." And Crockett? She never once mentioned his name again. She didn't have to, because she had become the name whispered in judicial chambers, the ghost in the footnotes, the question hanging behind every rational basis citation. The public saw a courtroom exchange. The court saw a fault line they could no longer step over without answering for it. And Kavanaugh, once the symbol of constitutional certainty, had become a symbol of something else. What happens when unchecked power meets undeniable truth? He used to fear no hearing. Now he feared the next Jasmine Crockett. But the consequences of that day didn't stop at headlines or private court whispers. It carved itself into legal history. 1 year later, what began as a lone voice in a congressional chamber had become legend. In nearly every law school across the country, professors now reference something called the Crockett test, a framework for evaluating judicial consistency through comparative precedent. It was no longer just a term. It was a symbol of legal clarity used in exams, moot court arguments, and bar prep questions. Students debated it fiercely. What would Crockett ask here? Became a serious question in classrooms from Yale to Stanford. The American Bar Association created an award in her name, the Jasmine Crockett Prize for Judicial Integrity. It was awarded annually to young attorneys who challenged legal contradictions with logic, evidence, and grace under pressure. At the first ceremony, a tearful honoree whispered into the mic, "This isn't just a prize. It's a reminder that courage can be constitutional." Crockett didn't attend the ceremony, but her photo, taken the moment she held up the 2 court cases in Congress, stood tall behind the stage. It had become iconic, but perhaps her most lasting impact was legislative. Her bill, the Judicial Transparency and Consistency Act, which many expected to die quietly in partisan deadlock, had instead shocked Washington. Not only did it pass the House with bipartisan support, but even the Senate Judiciary Committee gave it a rare unanimous vote to proceed. The act required the Supreme Court to publish explanations for any deviations in legal logic between similar cases within a 5-year window. "It's not radical," Crockett had said in a CNN interview. "It's responsible. If the court expects deference, the people expect clarity." The phrase, "if the court expects deference, the people expect clarity," became a rallying cry for reformers. It appeared on placards at rallies. It became the opening slide of lectures. Even critics of Crockett couldn't ignore the movement she sparked. "She did something most lawyers only dream of," one Harvard professor remarked. "She altered the culture of the judiciary without ever sitting on the bench." What truly stunned the public, however, wasn't the law or the lectures. It was how the story of that confrontation had evolved. What once was framed as a heated exchange was now seen as a defining moment in modern constitutional history. Documentaries replayed the scene in slow motion. Her line, "Sir, if legal logic only applies when it's convenient, then the Constitution is no longer sacred. It's selective," was now etched into the marble wall outside Georgetown Law's ethics wing. Tour guides paused in front of it, letting students take photos in silence. And so, the Crockett moment became more than just a viral clip. It became a test, a law, a lecture, a movement. For the first time in decades, faith in reason had cut through the fog of power. As one former justice anonymously told The Atlantic, "We're all a little more careful now, because somewhere out there, someone like Crockett might be watching." Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.